Hello and welcome back to part 3 of the lecture. This part focuses on the character of Tituba, but it also focuses on the historical original, the real person Tituba, and who she was. There's a debate about this, and some of you who've read ahead may have noticed this already. Tituba is sometimes referred to as an African American, and sometimes she's referred to as a Native American. So what is going on here? What is her actual racial identity? What sort of ethnic and cultural background do we imagine this person as having had? And how do creative writers create a character out of what is or is not known and what has, or in some cases has not been researched about her background, to explore some of these issues of race and racism and anti-racism in American culture? So, first slide, you have 2 questions here in the first 2 slides. First slide, was Tituba African American? Well, she's often portrayed as such, isn't she? And you'll have seen this in Miller. She's clearly an African American, she's a black American, and she's a slave in his play. Here are some comparators. I think the most useful one is one that I think Miller may have known, and it's Shirley Barker's novel Peace, My Daughters from 1949. Barker's a relatively minor writer, and her novel is not particularly well known. She was also a poet. This is a classic portrayal of Tituba. And it is broadly racist, it seems to me. It does portray Tituba in ways which are stereotypical and are quite antagonistic, and it blames her for what happened to her and the others at Salem. And we'll look in a minute at a critical Bernard Rosenthal and his explanation of that blaming. So Barker portrays Tituba as what she calls a Negro servant, and she talks about her as holding one shining black arm high, her face uplifted towards it, her usually good-natured eyes turned mean and shifty. The hand clutched a small grey-clad poppet stuck with a long iron pin. Tituba chanted some strange West Indian words. So Tituba is portrayed in this text, as she is in The Crucible, as actually practising magic. Here, this poppet with a pin stuck through it sounds like the classic European form of magic, which is image magic. You make an image of the person that you want to attack, perhaps by making a cloth doll of them, perhaps a wax image or a clay image, and you stick pins or thorns in it in order to hurt them. This is the idea of sympathetic magic, that if you hurt this image, the person whom it represents will sympathetically respond, and that will be by the notion of correspondences. So if you stab the heart or the liver of the puppet, the little doll that you've made, the image that you've made, then the liver and heart of the real person will also suffer. So Tituba is portrayed as a witch here. She tells those who attend what the book refers to as her circle of girls, of women in her community, Tituba Obi woman in own country, and she beats a skin drum and she chants until the people in her circle, are primarily young white girls, fall into a kind of dancing trance and they end up having convulsive fits. This is the classic narrative, and we'll examine why that is in a minute. It's the one that Miller picks up on. You know, his Tituba is in some respects a witch. She does do magic. She chants in the forest, she dances in the forest, she does things with regard to harming and killing other people. She enables the magic and indeed to some extent witchcraft of characters like Abigail who want to harm their enemies. And this is made particularly obvious in the film of The Crucible that Miller scripted later in his life. So we can actually see him writing a screenplay which shows us that scene in the forest, which is not in the play of The Crucible, but is in the film of The Crucible, which I'd urge you to have a look at. So this is a depiction of this black woman as a witch, and it uses her West Indian culture against her. It makes us think of these strange West Indian words as perhaps being magical words, perhaps being witchy words. There's a notion of something like voodoo here, and you can look up the use of the term voodoo and think about how it's been used. Often it's a great misrepresentation of West Indian and indeed before that West African religions. There's a lot of writing about voodoo in the mid-20th century, particularly in American culture, and there's a great fear of it, that it's some kind of terrifying magic. And that is linked up with fears about different racial groups. It's linked up with white American identities in the period. Let's come back to that, but let's go on to the next slide and ask the other question. Well, Was Tituba Native American then? Firstly, was she African American? Then was she Native American? I think she probably was. You know, hand on heart, having looked at the documents, this is what I think. I think she was probably a Native American woman. And I think that because she's described in the documents from 1692 as an Indian woman, or as the Indian. These documents are handwritten by people who are not especially literate. And she's described as a servant rather than a slave, but that is a very slippery identity in the period, and it's difficult to imagine what her status exactly is. She certainly is not free in the modern sense of the word, but we're not quite sure what her status is. Nevertheless, there is some specificity about describing her ethnicity. And people in the period knew well the difference between Indian people, as they called them, Native American people, and black people, who they would usually refer to as a Negro. So, for example, there are other black characters, other black people in the narrative of Salem. There's Candy, who's described as a Negro servant. There's a woman called Mary Black, whose name specifically identifies her as a black person and who is described as a Negro. So it's interesting that Tituba is not described in those ways. I'm not wholly convinced she was black, and I'm a lot more convinced that she was Native American. So we have to ask, and we'll ask this in a moment, how does she mutate from being a Native American historical original, probably, to being an African American character in mid-20th century fiction? How does that happen? In 1867, one of the key players steps onto the stage, and that's Charles Wentworth Upham. He wrote a big history called Salem Witchcraft, which you can still get and is often still regarded as a standard history, although, it was written in 1867. He describes her as of mixed race. He's one of the people who starts that transition. So he describes her as Indian, but he also talks about her as black, and he talks about her as a slave. Think about his historical context. You know, we've looked at Gaskell writing in England in the mid-19th century, but Charles Wentworth Upham, writing in America in the mid-19th century, is writing from the period of about 1830 right the way through to 1867. What happens in that period? The American Civil War. One of the major issues of the Civil War is the freeing of the slaves. So people are thinking about slavery, they're thinking about race in mid-19th century America. And Upham seems to be reacting to that in some way. He's thinking about Tituba's status. Is she a slave or a servant? He comes down on the side of slave, and he moves her from being a purely Indian person, so a Native American person, of course, to being a black person. When people look back at this in contemporary culture, and I've got a couple of writers for you to look at in connection with this. The first one is Elaine Bresslaw. When writers like Elaine Bresslaw look back at this in the 1990s, in her book Tituba, Reluctant Witch of Salem, for example, she wants to question this, and she goes to Barbados and she finds records of an enslaved child called Tatuba in Barbados in 1670. This is notable because Samuel Parris lived in Barbados from 1673 to 80, so he was there for a long time. And one of the things that Upham assumes is that while he was there, he bought a slave, possibly this enslaved child, Tatuba, brought her back to Massachusetts as his slave, as his servant, as whatever her identity by then was. Now, this person in the record could be the same person. Her name is often spelled in different ways. So we've got, and I've got some examples on the slide, Tituba, Titapa, Titibay, Titubay and Tetaby are all examples from the records about our character Tituba, our real person Tituba. These are all variant spellings of her name. Nobody knew what to make of it among her recorders, and so they spelled it in different ways. I'd be inclined to accept this. I'd be inclined to think this is her, but I'm also really wary of accepting anything without absolute proof, which is very difficult in this historical period. It may be her, it may not be her. If I had to choose, I'd say it is her. You can make up your own mind. Bresslaw found particularly that a South American people called the Arawak people had a grouping known as the Tetabetana. And she speculates that maybe Tituba was a South American, a native South American rather than a native North American, Perhaps she was enslaved in Barbados. There were raids on the South American mainland to capture people and sell them into slavery. And it was not of any concern what race they were, what tribal grouping they belonged to, what religion they were even. People were simply enslaved because they could be caught and they could be sold for the profit of others. So Tituba was probably caught up in that. Now, whether or not she had African heritage as well, whether or not she lived in a mixed culture, which I suspect she did, where West African practices were also being shared among an enslaved and servant grouping, whether she also brings to that, and Bresler argues about this in her book, a South American understanding of the world and its spirits, its inspiritedness, is a really interesting question. It's really interesting to think about who this historical individual is. But I think to some extent we have to accept that we won't know. We do, however, have to be really sensitive in talking about this because we don't know this person. We don't know her ethnicity, her cultural setting. We don't know her race. We don't know how she would have thought about herself. I think that's really important to say. The other writer on the next slide that I'd urge you to think about in this context is Bernard Rosenthal, whose book Salem Stories is really useful from the point of view of thinking about both race and gender in depictions of the Salem witch trials. He sums up for us what he thinks the arguments are, and I would tend to agree with him. He says, A, he's right, there's no evidence that Tituba practiced any voodoo or powwow, the Native American equivalent, magic. There's no evidence of this. The white women in the text are those who are said to be practicing magic. There's no evidence that Tituba practiced anything or brought down anything on her own head. There's no evidence that she chanted in a strange language. There's no evidence that she made puppets. There's no evidence that she did anything which could be considered as her own ethnic kind of magic. She did what white women told her to do, and that is a different matter. So white women and girls prompted what were later referred to as superstitious responses to illness. They asked that a witch cake be baked. They undertook fortune telling, such as the egg and glass technique, where you break the white of an egg into water and you look at the shape that it makes. And from that you predict the trade or craft of your future husband. And Rosenthal surveys this quite correctly. He's right about what there is and there isn't in the records. And he argues that as a woman of colour, she has been scapegoated. She's been wrongly blamed for bringing these superstitious practices to Salem, and her history has been rewritten. Other women, he says, Abigail Williams and Bridget Bishop, have also been rewritten and blamed, and you can look at the history of Bridget Bishop as a really interesting analogy for the story of Tituba. So when we get on to Arthur Miller, who raises Abigail's age, fixes Tituba's ethnicity and her race, and sets up Abigail as a sexual temptress and Tituba to some extent as a kind of magical temptress, Rosenthal says this is racism, this is sexism. There's really no way around this. He's drawing on the arguments of a mid-century American historian called Chadwick Hanson, but Rosenthal is really the person who sums this up for us. And I think it's really important to think about those contexts. So we've looked at the idea that what we're seeing represented in stories about the Salem trials is historical fact. We've looked at the notion that they're realist texts to a large extent. We've also thought about them as activist texts that want to change something, that want to have empathy with innocent victims of witch trials. But what we're also starting to think about towards the end of the lecture is the flaws in those texts, the empathy that they do not have, the things that they do not spot about historical accuracy or inaccuracy, and the unknowability of the circumstances of some of the historical characters, the real people, who subsequently become fictional. So, for the final slide, I'd like you to find and list 3 academic books that help you think about this. Put the titles and the descriptions of the books online. Write a little bit about what you found useful in them and why you think your classmates ought to read them, and put that in the module forum. And also find and list 3 fictions that portray these witch trials. You can do this over the course of time. You don't have to rush and do it in the course of the next week. That's absolutely fine. But over the course of time, we're going to be spending quite a bit of time on the Salem trials and these notions that we've talked about in this lecture. Find some fictions that you'd like us to talk about, and we can also incorporate that into the subsequent weeks of the module. And finally, I want you to think about how you'd write about this as a historian or creative writer. This is also thinking ahead to your reviews that you'll be writing later on. If you had to write a history of the Salem trials as an academic history, or perhaps as a novel or a play, or you had to make a film about it, what would you pick as the salient factors here? You know, what are the sort of factual things that you'd want people to consider? What choices would you make about the depiction of characters like Tituba or Elizabeth Proctor? How would you think about them, and what choices would you make as a writer if you had to tell the story of Salem?